Doctors with disabilities exist in small but impactful numbers. How do they navigate their journey? What are the challenges? What are the benefits to patients and to their peers? And what can we learn from their experiences? Join us as we explore the stories of doctors, PAs, nurses, OTs, PTs, pharmacists, dentists, and other health professionals with disabilities. We'll also be interviewing the researchers and policymakers that drive medicine forward towards real equity and inclusion. I am Peter Poullos, and I am thrilled to bring you the Docs with Disabilities podcast.
Hello, and welcome back to the Docs with Disabilities podcast. Today, we are joined by two guests and namesakes, Drs. Heather Feldner and Heather Evans. Dr. Heather Feldner is an assistant professor in the Department of Rehabilitation Medicine, adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Mechanical Engineering, core faculty in the Disability Studies program, and an associate director of the Center for Research and Education on Accessible Technology and Experiences at the University of Washington. Her research is centered at the intersection of mobility, disability, and technology in both how perceptions of disability emerge and evolve through technology use, and in the design and implementation of pediatric mobility technology. Dr. Heather Evans is a socio-legal scholar who focuses on the ways in which institutions such as law, higher education, and the medical field interact with marginalized populations. She earned a PhD in sociology at the University of Washington and teaches courses in the Department of Sociology, the Disability Studies program, and the Law, Societies, and Justice Department at UW. Her current work is in the field of critical disability studies, examining disclosure, identity management, and workplace accommodations among people with physical, mental, and sensory differences that aren't always apparent. She is also committed to community-based research and consulting for local social justice organizations, primarily focusing on disparities within the criminal justice system. In their conversation with Dr. Pete Poullos, Dr. Evans and Dr. Feldner discussed their arrival to disability studies scholarship at the University of Washington, the curious and impactful forms that their work has taken as a product of inter-departmental collaboration, and their visions for a medical education that is more cognizant of and that actively centers the dynamic lived experiences of those with disabilities. We begin with introductions from Dr. Feldner and Dr. Evans.
Hi, everyone. My name is Heather Feldner. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a cisgendered white woman. I do not currently identify as disabled or with a disability, and I think that's important to recognize because that really limits the perspective that I can bring to these topics. I am a parent of a child with a disability as well as a daughter of a parent with a disability, so I do have that caregiving perspective. And I came to this work through my training initially as a physical therapist. I worked as a PT clinician for almost 13 years full-time before going back into academia. And when I went back into my PhD, I had the opportunity to pursue a PhD in disability studies, and that really brought me to a new realm of considering disability as a social construct, as a way of being that is, treated differently in our society. And so that was a wonderful experience for me to kind of reconcile and sit with some of the tensions that often exist between a traditional medical or rehabilitation model of training and this new, for me, perspective on disability and disability justice. And it has been a really awesome experience over the last decade or so to be able to work in that space and kind of think about the tensions and the opportunities and the intersections there. And it's been really fun. So very happy to be here and be working with Evans and to be chatting with you today, Pete.
What prompted this move? What happened in year 13? I want to go back to school.
It was interesting because I knew even in PT school that I wanted to go get a PhD someday. But I thought that I needed to be out in the clinic and be working in different aspects of clinical care before doing that. And so it was always kind of this kernel of interest for me. And it got to the point where I started to get a little burnt out, to be honest. And I started to question like what was my role and function and how was I impacting the lives of the people I was working with outside of the clinic, right? We kind of think about like, oh, go into the magic building and you're going to get all these skills. And then you leave and it's like you're in this inaccessible world where you're treated differently. And I struggled with that a little bit. And so I think that that is what kind of started that process for me. And you know, from a practical side too, I had my first two children and, you know, it was kind of the right time to consider going back. At that point, they were getting a little bit older. And so all of those things kind of came together in the perfect storm, I think, and led me down the path.
You still practice physical therapy at all?
You know, I still have my license and I teach in the University of Washington Doctor of Physical Therapy program. And I do interact with, so I worked in pediatrics for my entire career clinically. And a lot of that was in seating and mobility technology. And so I still work with kids with seating and mobility technology, although not as a clinical role, more as a researcher role. And so I'm working with kids and families, but it's related to mobility research and not necessarily clinical care.
What about you, Evans? What's your story?
It's always so hard to follow Feldner. Uh, my name is Heather Evans. I am also a white cisgendered woman. I do identify as disabled. I use she, her pronouns. And, in spaces like this, with this kind of audience, I feel comfortable saying I identify as disabled, as someone with a chronic illness, as someone with a mental disorder, and I strongly identify as Crip. And, what you started out talking a little bit about language, and in these spaces, it's always interesting to hear how different people connect with some of these ideas and therefore identify themselves. As far as, coming to this field, there's so many narratives to tell there. I think that really for me, as long as I can remember, I have been engaged in some way with disability. I grew up in rural poverty where, impaired function was not only relatively normalized, but frankly, it was expected in the kinds of workplaces that folks had. Just as an example, my stepfather, when I was very young, worked as a young man in a uranium mine, which kind of blows my mind today to talk about people working in uranium mines. For most of my childhood, he went and he worked for a company that made industrial batteries after the mines closed down, and he and his fellow workers would be laid off like every 3 to 6 months because the lead levels in their blood would test too high. And so they would be furloughed without pay, of course, until he could pass the blood test and return to work. So, it was really that combination, I think, of poverty, of lack of formal education, and that kind of ever present need to survive meant that I grew up around a lot of people who either started out with or who acquired over time impairments or different ways of functioning. And therefore, they needed to figure out how to do things, how to do everyday things in pretty non typical ways. For myself, I don't recall a time in my life that I didn't have an anxiety disorder. So that was kind of my first introduction to learning how to navigate the world around me and in managing the expectations of those around me. Really, I came to formal education later. So I was in my 30s when I finally found my way to institutionalized education. And by then, I had nearly 10 years of living with a mysterious potpourri of symptoms that were eventually diagnosed as multiple sclerosis. And by that time, I was in graduate school, being trained as a sociologist, and I was really interested in how the large macro structures, so things like the law, reproduced existing social stratifications, and the ways in which changes to those structures, like the law, could actually disrupt those patterns and enact real social change. And my experience was that when you start to examine the systemic marginalization and oppression of groups at that kind of institutional level, you begin to see these really distinct patterns that are repeated across institutions, right? So the same kinds of mechanisms that erect barriers to and marginalize specific ways of being in our criminal justice system, those mechanisms have direct analogs in higher education. They have direct analogs in the field of healthcare and medicine. And so while I want to keep pushing on all of those different fronts, it was really in disability studies that I found a home, not just in terms of my life experiences, but also in terms of my intellectual proclivities, right? To examine social phenomena from a really critical perspective. And I mean that in an academic sense, critical, but also it's where I found my home in terms of community. As I said, I definitely identified as disabled prior to beginning this work, but now I very deeply identify as Crip, and that is part of the community that I belong to.
So interesting what you said about disability being normal in the society in which you lived. It was like that, right? For most of history, that disability was a normal part of life and expected, with like injury and illness, losing a hand in like a sawmill, or developing chronic lung disease from being in a mine. I mean, I think it's only been in our more recent history that disability has become like abnormal and other. So I think it's really interesting that you've lived in both of those worlds.
I think to your point, Peter, is that it's always been present. Disabled people have always been here, have always been figuring out how to do everyday things, maybe in non-typical ways. But so much of it is really about framing. Certainly, even I don't mean to romanticize in any way my childhood in that everybody was incredibly accepting. It was just more typical to not think of a lot of those impairments, especially acquired injuries, as disability.
Mhm.
Disability is a label, has a very different role in that fitting a person into a certain kind of social status. And for that, I also would point the finger at our federal government, who within our federal legislation we have 3 different active definitions of disability in our federal laws, right? We have a Social Security definition of disability that is purely about your ability to work. There's no real medical premise for that. To directly counter that, we have the definition with the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is all about enabling disabled people to work, which has a very different way of defining what disability means. So when we talk about disability, one of the ways in which it's different than some of the other marginalized groups is that there is such contested language around disability, not just in terms of good words and bad words, but just in our definitions. That depending on different stakeholders, they're using entirely different ways of defining what disability is.
What does it mean to be Crip?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. For me personally, Crip is to find both pride and joy in my experiences of non-typical ways of doing things, as well as to find solidarity and comfort, and again, pride and joy and respect and learning among my other Crip friends. I think that, in terms of academics, when we talk about Crip, I think we're generally referencing not just, shared experiences of discrimination or shared experiences of barriers in the environment, but individuals who have shared experiences of solidarity, of pursuing disability and social justice more broadly, and people who find pride as well as special insight and learning and perspectives within those experiences.
Oh, I think I might be Crip.
Welcome to the group.
Yeah. When I teach about disability language do's and don'ts, I say that cripple is a word that we shouldn't use. And then I say, yeah, you can't say cripple unless you're crippin'.
Exactly.
And I'm definitely crippin'.
Love it. What I love is, and that what you just demonstrated, Pete, is that it's a noun, but it's also a verb, and it has this sense of reclaiming. And that's something I think that we tend to talk about a lot is when somebody does identify as Crip, it's this reclaiming of power that has been diminished by some external force. it's very intersectional, right? Obviously for the disability community. And so you hear or you see like hashtag Crip the vote, the documentary Crip Camp, right? And so there's been this reclaiming of that word, but also the action and the community and the identity that goes behind it. And I think that that's just really powerful.
In the next section, Dr. Evans and Dr. Feldner go on to retrace their paths to their current roles and pursuits at the University of Washington. Follow along as they discuss the tensions that accompany doing disability studies scholarship within a rehabilitation medicine program, the many initiatives in bloom to provide students with community and disability studies education, and the informality with which disability studies often continues to be made to function in academia.
I had the privilege of coming to University of Washington in 2016 for my postdoctoral work, ironically in mechanical engineering. So it's all kind of centered in this mobility technology realm, but had this opportunity to be a part of mechanical engineering for my postdoc, and then got an opportunity to stay on as faculty back in rehab in 2018. And so University of Washington has a disability studies program that includes some academic programs, a minor, a major, as well as a graduate certificate program. And that is part of what drew me to the university to begin with, is because I kind of I have this interesting conglomeration of background, and all of those things could mesh together in a really cool way at UW. And so was lucky enough to join the disability studies faculty when I became a permanent faculty member in rehab. And that is when I got to meet Evans and the rest of our fantastic staff and faculty. And we kind of peripherally were in the same circles for a short while there. And then in 2020, I think it was, we wound up getting a small research grant through the UW Center for Leadership and Innovation in Medical Education, specifically to look at the experiences of people who identify as disabled with a disability or with a chronic health condition, or as little d, big D deaf on University of Washington campus. And so we really wanted to kind of gain qualitative perspectives about their experiences on campus, their experiences with ableism, their experiences with allyship, their experiences in healthcare. And that was what really initially brought us together to work on this particular project. And I'll let Evans jump in because her journey has taken a couple of turns since then too. But we have really exploded this area of collaboration, and it's just been awesome.
It is quite a journey to try to map out where we've all been. So I was trained at the University of Washington in sociology, but of course, I was a sociolegal scholar and my main field was disability studies. So everything I taught, every class I pitched, every guest lecture I did, I would somehow find a way to make disability a focus. And I was very active with the disability studies program. It is a small program at the University of Washington, and we don't have a lot of infrastructure. And so it's a lot of unpaid service work that we all do to keep the program running. And I've just worked with a number of colleagues across many departments. My work is very interdisciplinary. And I got to know Heather Feldner and some other colleagues in the Department of Rehabilitation. And currently, that's where I'm at. I'm actually in an acting assistant professor role in the Department of Rehabilitation. And it was somewhat ironic to me to have folks welcome me in as I would come in. I was like, I've spent the last 10 years criticizing your field. And now they were all saying, yeah, we love it. Come in, be part of our team. Tell us more. And then when I met Dr. Feldner, she's already there. She's a true disability studies scholar. And so we joke about, taking over from the inside, subverting the School of Medicine.
Well, I was looking at the list of faculty in disability studies at UW, and there are 5 people who also have appointments in the Department of Rehabilitation. You have PT and OT. I think, do you have an RN in there or an MD?
Special education for sure with our colleague Mark Harness.
Yeah, you guys did take over from the inside. I'm understanding a little bit better. Our Department of Rehabilitation at Stanford, they're interested in disability activism, especially some of their residents,
Mhm.
but their research and their clinical focus is definitely more on sports medicine and not really specifically taking care of patients with multiple chronic medical conditions or disabilities, especially over the long term. We don't even see those kind of patients that much at Stanford because our family medicine department doesn't take Medi-Cal. And of course, a lot of us are poor and on Medi-Cal and therefore go to public hospitals. So I think it's really interesting that Department of Rehabilitation has disability studies scholars on its faculty.
Mhm.
I mean, how did that happen?
That's a really interesting question, and I think one of the things that makes me think about is, as we kind of talked about earlier, there's been this traditional tension between disability studies, social or political relational model perspective of disability as a multifaceted construct, and this medical perspective that we know is very historically ingrained in our training, in our education, in our medical practices. And I would say that it is rare, at least in my own personal experience, to come across a department such as ours at UW that is not only welcoming of those different perspectives, but willing to kind of embrace that and explore those tensions and to really see that as a strength rather than as a point of weakness. I had been at other institutions where I was flat out told, you have to pick. You have to pick rehab or you have to pick disability studies because they're two fundamentally different. You can't have a joint appointment. You can't pursue both of these. And luckily, there had been mentors in my own experience that had proven otherwise. I'm thinking of like Barbara Gibson, who's one of the earliest examples that I know of a PT doing disability studies research up in Canada. And so having influences like that, thinking, well, isn't that the point to kind of engage in these tensions so that we can improve our lives and improve our fields and improve our educational systems and our healthcare systems for everyone? And so it was hard for me as a junior faculty member coming into a space and trying to embrace that and put that forward because I was nervous how that would have been received. And since day one at UW, there's just some kind of, it just works. And the leadership in our department have embraced it and they have shown that they want to learn more. And there are people reaching out to us saying, hey, this is really interesting. How can we think about this in our practice, in our education systems, in the way that we run meetings or conferences? And it has been really awesome because people, I think, are willing to sit with that tension and they see that as a strength. And I do think we have a long way to go. Let's be frank, we're all ingrained in these very ableist institutions and processes that we still need to chip away at, but people are willing to do that work and support that work. And I think that has just been something that's been really unique and special about UW.
I would add just the other side of that from the UW story. Since I was trained there and been at the University of Washington since 2003, she mumbled very quickly. And in growing the disability studies program, there was quite a bit of tension about the degree to which the program wanted, frankly, even representation from the medical school. And we went through our own journey of trying to work together. It's always difficult when you have extremely interdisciplinary teams. There's always some challenges. But because of those historical tensions that Feldner was referencing, there was real concern about having the disability studies program, quote, taken over by folks from the medical field. And so there was a lot of work done on the College of Arts and Sciences side as well among colleagues, folks like myself who really advocated that it's a strength, it's always a strength. And it's just been such a great synergy of having individuals from so many different disciplines and skill sets come together and work. And I really think that right now we're just growing. And as Feldner said, there's a lot of work to be done on all different sides, but I feel like we're all benefiting from learning from each other.
Just as an example of that, this past summer, we were able to start a new elective in rehab medicine, and it was open to all of our academic programs, which include PT, OT, as well as prosthetics and orthotics. And it was a course that was focused on disability and health through the lens of disability studies. And our students were asking for this. We had done like little lectures here and there, as everyone does, based on their own expertise and their own background and such. And our students kept saying, why aren't we getting more of this? Like, this is really important. And so I think that's the other thing that has kind of shifted the momentum a little bit, that our students are coming into their own and growing in their education in this very intersectional way, and in this way that recognizes that these are complex issues, that we can learn how to physically manipulate the environment. We can work with someone's individual body, but that there's this bigger context to that. And I think that that's been really exciting. So this elective that we ran for the first time last summer, and we're going to continue, really delved into those tensions. And our rehab students were being taught by folks with philosophy backgrounds, folks with sociology backgrounds, folks with rehab backgrounds as well. And so it created this really interesting classroom experience that I think the students were really excited about and they were asking for, but one that can continue, I think, to maybe inform how we look at our education practices, especially in relation to healthcare. So there's lessons to be learned in both directions, but especially for healthcare, I'm really excited to see the growth and the opportunity that we have potential for in the coming years.
I can talk a little more about outside of the School of Medicine. Again, the Disability Studies program itself is almost like a loose conglomeration of folks who have different interests. And it does span the 3 campuses. We have faculty and students who are involved from all 3 campuses at the University of Washington, not just the Seattle campus. And aside from that, we've got a very active student advocacy group, our Student Commission on Disability. We have a disability/deaf student center. So it's just a hangout space as well as a space for, folks to come into to share resources, gossip, hang out, engage in art and activism, as well as learning activities. And then we've got a number of centers that focus on either accessible technology, that are in the human-centered design and engineering program. We've got a very active School of Social Work that has been working hard in the last 5 years to incorporate more disability cultural competency training in their field. And so again, we're spreading our tendrils across the university, and it's actually very, very exciting. It's a really exciting time now to be in disability studies. And then Feldner, I'll hand it over to you to talk about Create and some of those other groups.
Yeah, we had the opportunity during the beginning stages of the pandemic to come together with a group of folks that had been working on accessibility related research in a variety of different disciplines. And so through our connection and looking at new sources of collaboration, as well as new opportunities to kind of be cross-disciplinary and reach out to different groups in our community, advocacy groups, we formed CREATE, which is an acronym that stands for Center for Research and Education on Accessible Technology and Experiences. Hence why we call it CREATE, because that's a really long title. But what is so cool about CREATE is that it is faculty and staff from across rehabilitation, mechanical engineering, human-centered design and engineering, computer science, our information school. So it's going into the realm of digital accessibility. It's going into the realm of co-design and community engagement. And it just is a unique opportunity, and there's several of us involved in Create that have disability studies backgrounds as well. And so the social model is really overarching the activities that we're doing in Create. And so we're doing some research grants. We're doing a lot of collaboration with industry in our area. Seattle's a big source of industry in terms of, Microsoft and Meta and Google. And so we're really working with those industries in terms of access and just doing a lot of community engagement with partners around the area that have really been leading the charge in terms of designing for access and advocating for access in a variety of different ways, whether that's physical access, digital access, etc. So that's been really fun. We also have a great group on campus called Do It, and that stands for Disabilities, Opportunities, Internet Working, and Technology. And that is a great group that has really focused on educational access, but also in helping recruit and retain disabled students coming to campus. They have programs for high school students with disabilities to kind of come and navigate campus, learn the accessible routes, advocate for additional accessibility measures. What's neat is that everyone's trying to support and build each other's work up, right? It's not like, oh, this is in competition and this focuses only on this and this other group focuses only on this. We're really trying to amplify all of the work that's being done to help improve access in and around campus. And again, I think we all recognize there's a lot of work to be done, but the momentum has just been really exciting over the past couple of years.
That is so exciting.
Yeah.
Where can I get a job application there and work with you guys?
We'd love to have it. It'd be amazing.
That's what I was going to say. I feel like it's always my job to rain a little bit on the parade in these because I agree with everything that Feldner said. And as I mentioned, I think it is a very exciting time. One of the reasons that we are such a loosely connected or federated group is because we don't have the institutional infrastructure or support.
Mhm.
And so, I have an acting assistant position, which means I'm still basically an adjunct. And since 2016, I have held adjunct positions, generally part time, teaching, doing research. I also do contract research on the side because Seattle is not a cheap place to live. It's still a reality that as hungry as students are, whether we're talking about medical trainees or we're talking about just undergraduate students getting a general education, they are hungry for disability studies. They are hungry for understanding how they can, both individually or as groups, or again at institutional levels, make changes. And yet, we just can't seem to get the support for more infrastructure to make, for example, our disability studies program into a disability studies department. So while you would be at the top of my list, Peter, to send you a resume, I would say you're always welcome to come and work for free with the rest of us. But I don't encourage you to do that.
So what's the difference between critical disability studies and then disability studies in general? Is there a difference?
I'll take a first stab at that, and then I'll let Feldner tell you what the real difference is. So, in the field of disability studies broadly, it was really an academic field that emerged out of initially the disability rights movement. And we can or we can't go down the talk of then kind of when there was a parallel movement of disability justice has kind of grown out of that. But when disability studies emerged in academia, and so there was a lot of political activity in the 1960s and 70s. The social model of disability was first articulated in the late 70s in the UK. And it took a while for that to kind of bubble up into the academic sphere. And disability studies again emerged just as a body of scholarship that was really challenging the idea of this very deficit heavy perspective of disability. And so it really picked up on the work of folks who studied gender, folks who studied race, to think about disability not as a medical attribute, but as a social construction. Critical disability studies is often used to really denote when that academic field started to really expand in and take lessons from, say, critical race theorists like Kimberly Crenshaw to really start to grapple with intersectionality in a very critical way. And so I often explain to students that when you hear critical in an academic field, that should immediately signal critical race theory, critical sexual or sexuality and genders theories, critical queer theory, critical Crip theory. And what critical there means in academia is any field that starts, its very starting point is a deep interrogation of the context in which that particular social construction emerged, how the label, so the kind of defining boundaries of who's included and who's not, have changed across time, but also how those boundaries change from one culture to another. So there's also a much deeper awareness in critical disability studies of how westernized and how white disability studies has been. And so it's not to say that there isn't tremendous overlap. And for most audiences, they can mean pretty much the same thing. But as always in academia, we have to add in more and more adjectives in order to make things less clear and yet more specifically locate ourselves in those conversations. That's how I would think of the difference.
So it's heavily centered on intersectionality.
Mhm.
It is critical disability studies. It's impossible to really center disability justice and the idea of not just studying, but actually finding ways to reduce inequity, finding ways to move us forward in terms of social justice. It's just not possible to do that in isolation. And by that, I mean isolate one identity. It's impossible to talk about the marginalization of people who've been historically labeled as disabled without talking about the marginalization of people who have been historically labeled as non-white or folks who were seen as non-gender conforming. These are interlocking systems of oppression. And I often argue that ableism is the system of oppression, that way of thinking of that there's one superior way of looking, of being, of doing, of moving, of processing information, that one superior way of being, ableism underpins all those other isms, all those other systems of oppression. In certain audiences, to make that distinct, I've talked about able-bodied supremacy or able-minded supremacy to really get across the point that, again, you can't tackle one system of oppression without engaging with the intersectionality of experiences for people who experience oppression.
Absolutely. Did you want to add to that, Feldner?
I, again, am intimidated to speak after Evans's wonderful summarization of that. And I agree with all of that. And I think one of the things for me that sticks out in that edition of Critical, right, is if you look back at the birth and growth of disability studies and disability justice, the people who were able to bring that social issue forward were the people that still had a little bit of power, even though they were significantly marginalized. It was white males with physical disabilities.
Yes, it was me.
But how important was that? Because that set the stage and there was credence that was given to that group saying how they were marginalized. And then it is from there. If you think back to the Section 504 sit-ins and the one that lasted in San Francisco for the longest, and that kind of really was the catalyst for so many rights and justice movements after, it was the disability community and the Black Panthers that were working together, right? It was the Vietnam veterans that were coming in and they were all supporting each other. And so I think it's this point of we have to use our privilege in whatever way that is granted to us to call attention to these inequities. But then we also have to recognize that the people who were not necessarily given credit for driving this movement forward. And so, again, I think it's looking at some of those tensions there in terms of who was recognized as the leaders and the founders, and then looking at really how intersectional that was and how maybe that it's been a little bit more siloed rather than intersectional. And so it's calling attention to that deep intersectionality that has kind of led us to where we're at.
In the following section, the conversation turns to current and future approaches to integrate and improve disability education in medicine. Listen or read along as Dr. Evans and Dr. Feldner discuss the lessons learned from their study of lived experiences of disability and ableism in rehabilitation education and clinical practice, as well as their reflections on the possible reframing needed to provide true access to disabled trainees in medicine.
One thing really scared me in that paper that you wrote, and it was this description of medical training simulations intended to, quote, sensitize healthcare providers to experiences of disability or chronic illness that led doctors to minimize the lived experiences of their patients. This idea of like disability education or activism or training actually making things worse is horrifying. And I was wondering if you could give me some examples of how this happened and how we can avoid it.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that is such a good question. And here we go for the next hour of our discussion. I think, oh my gosh, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? And I think we have to recognize that no one has done this with the intent of that result. It's a bunch of non-disabled white people that thought that this was a good idea, and they didn't have that lived experience initially. It's like, this is not answering the questions that you want to ask in the ways that uplift this experience. Two classic examples for me. One that I did in PT school is we had the like wheelchair for a day experience where it was either wheelchairs or crutches or some sort of physical mobility aid. And our goal was to do 24 hours, and we had to navigate campus, our lives, whatever. And then what happened is at the end, we're all like, this sucks. Glad we don't have to deal with this on a regular basis. And it completely obliterated the point of pointing out real access barriers faced by people who use physical mobility aids. The other common one is like putting on the vision obstruction, like you either are blindfolded or you have the glasses that do some sort of change in your vision. And then you're thinking to yourself, oh, I'm so relieved that I don't have to deal with this on a daily basis. How pitiful. Like, I need to pity this poor person that has this visual impairment. And it's like, that is not someone's lived experience. And so it's a topic that has shown over and over again from the perspective of people with lived experience of disability that it negates the complexity, it's reductionist, and it produces an end result that is not what is intended. And we talk about, I think in the paper too, some alternatives, like what can be done instead that really gets at more of the crux of the social experience of being excluded and the barriers that are faced both physically and attitudinally.
This is one of those areas where it's really challenging because so many people really do come from like, oh, but we could get a slice of life, and having to again, like, whoa, let's back up and talk about what that is. So in the paper, one of the examples that we give is, and this is a healthcare professional who is insulin dependent, and they gave the example of having a doctor who said, "Oh yeah, I wore an insulin pump for an entire day." So I totally get what it's like to have diabetes. I mean, when you hear that out loud, you can immediately begin to understand how kind of offensive, minimizing, even just having that limited temporality of like, yeah, but you know that you've got this amount of time and then you get to take that off. But this is writ more widely, not just in healthcare. I'm thinking of, there was some really bad film that came out not too long ago. I think it was like Me Before You or You Before
Yes.
Me or
Yeah.
something. And it was
Yes.
such a classic example of, I actually haven't seen it, full disclosure, but I've taught disability representations in media, and many, many students had seen it. It's a film that's supposed to be portraying someone who has lived most of their life as a wheelchair user. And, I actually felt bad for some of the production team and the actor, because the actor afterwards was saying, well, I did all sorts of research, because the actor and the director and some folks spent some time with individuals who had just experienced some kind of major injury that took away their mobility. So, their mindset was just in that immediate experience of trauma and mourning. And so, I mean, when we talk about disability, when I talk about pride, when I talk about good things that come out of it, I am not trying to suggest that tragic things don't happen to people. Certainly, being in a major physical accident can be a tragedy. But as I'm sure you know, it's not like your life stops in that moment. And that there isn't growth and learning and adaptation that goes on. And it's too often that these simulation activities thrust an otherwise maybe able bodied person into a place where it's like, imagine if you were suddenly in an accident and today you lost your vision, rather than giving them some kind of insight into what is it like to live life as a blind person who relies on certain kind of accommodations or relies on certain types of built environments to move around in them. And so that is the missing piece, is that it really, the simulation activity puts people into a place of loss, not into a place of experiencing difference. It is one of those topics that you have to be careful as you gently cajole your colleagues out of their great idea of doing one of these simulation activities. But again, I think it comes back to, in critical disability studies, we shift the expertise away from the person with learned expertise and shift the focus to people with lived expertise. And so, if you want to know what it's like to wear an insulin pump, then maybe you should just talk to some folks who wear insulin pumps and find out what it's like. You don't need to strap on a piece of equipment for 6 hours and think that you've gained really deep insights from that way of being.
You guys may have read the Disability as Diversity textbook written by Lisa Meeks. She was the editor of that. The first chapter is by Neera Jain, and it's called Frameworks for Inclusion Toward a Transformative Approach. And in that chapter, she describes 3 approaches to disability inclusion in order of increasing inclusion. Those are the compliance model, the spirit of the law, and the transformative approach. So my question is, once medicine is transformed, what does that future state look like? I've asked this of several people, and I feel like the answer is a little elusive. Most people say that universal design is sort of critical to solving the problems of equity and inclusion. But what does this look like for an individual on a practical level? Say, I'm a third-year medical student, wheelchair user, starting my surgical clerkship. What do I do? Where do I go? What does this look like? I mean, it can't be an accommodations-based model anymore, which is very much based on the medical model and centering the onus of the problem on the person.
Well, first of all, huge shout out to Lisa and Neera. We had the privilege of getting to know them and working with them through some of our activities with Climb, and they came and gave an incredible keynote for our Climb Together symposium that was focused all on anti-ableism and medical education. And so it's just been a thrill and to get connected with them and with you. And I feel like we all should collaborate on lots of things.
Yes.
Yes. And so when I think about that, I think, oh my gosh, that is an overwhelming question, right? Like, what does this look like? And who am I to even be the one to think about, like, I don't have the right answers. Here's what I will say. When I think about this deeply, I think about We have to incorporate universal design, absolutely, 100%. Thinking about as that surgical resident, right? How are the ORs set up? What are the hours? What equipment are we using and how modular is that so that people can access what they need to do their work? How are tools designed? Thinking about the physical layout, but also thinking about what does it mean for you to be on call for 14 hours a day? Is that feasible and sustainable? No, that's not feasible and sustainable for anyone, right? But especially for people who may need rest breaks or sensory breaks or have physical needs that they need to take care of in that time. We all need to go to the bathroom. And so it's kind of a radical reframing of like what's expected of our healthcare professionals, right? In addition to that, though, I don't think accommodations will ever go away because people will always need individualized solutions to successfully access their roles. And so I really see it as a combination of the two. Like we definitely have to blow up the kind of standardized, everyone needs to lift 50 pounds kind of things, right? We need to get rid of and dismantle that furniture in an exam room is fixed, right? But we're always going to have to then be aware of and proactively ask people what they need to be successful. And I think one of the other things that I think about is where is that burden placed? Because that is typically something that is invisible labor on the part of a disabled person when entering a space. And so how can we as allies reduce that invisible labor so that we're really all in it together in a more meaningful way? I think it has to be a blend of both.
Feldner, we're totally on the same page. I had a very similar thought, Peter, when you just asked this question of like, whoa, we're not getting rid of accommodations. Pump your brakes, everyone. But I would say, like, thinking back about those models, like the spirit of the law kind of thing. I am pro spirit of the law. However, the law is only putting in a floor. The best case scenario of a law's application is to put in a floor. And I agree with what Feldner said about moving towards universal design, really just shaking off this idea that there's only one type of body or mind that should be in any particular space. We need to get rid of that in order to really embrace the idea of universal design. But universal design does not mean that there won't be barriers for some individuals. As someone with a chronic illness, my impairments and my abilities fluctuate dramatically over time. And so even trying to accommodate my own self in my experiences means that I have different needs at different times. And, I always think of Mia Mingus, who coined the term and talks about access intimacy. And for me, access intimacy is very tied to the idea of accommodations, but accommodations not as a checklist, right? But accommodations as in what kind of supports do you need right now that will enable you to be present, to engage, to participate in the way that you want? And so I would like us to move towards an idea of access, true access, being something that is negotiated in time, in place with a group of people. And if we can develop that sense of access intimacy, again, not knowing exactly that Peter and I have the exact same needs in any given space, but just the awareness that we might need to adjust the environment. We might need to put in some different ground rules, even if it's just for that conversation or for that class or for that work group in that particular meeting. So the utopian idea of like the after, once we incorporate universal design, we'll still have accommodations. And there can be no utopia when we talk about disability without dismantling capitalism. I know that we don't have time to go off on that, but I will just say we can't get there if we're all still expected to build X many widgets within our life and we're valued in that way.
As As the conversation comes to a close, Doctors Feldner and Evans offer their advice to trainees and those considering entering the medical field, encouraging students to seek support and find community amidst the challenges and often ableist structures of higher education.
I would say apply because we need more healthcare providers with disabilities. We need more students, we need more faculty. This is something that impacts 1 in 4 of all of us, and it's ubiquitous. And so why isn't it represented in our healthcare fields as well? And so looking for programs who have changed their admissions requirements. A lot of physical therapy programs out there still have lifting requirements, still have very ableist things that they're saying, if you don't check the box, don't even apply here. And there are a lot of programs that have started to change that and recognize that. And so I would say look for those programs. Just as much as programs are interviewing you, you need to interview them, because that will give you the insight in terms, and like asking questions straight out. How are you supporting students with disabilities in your program? How are you recruiting students with disabilities in your program? How many faculty that you know of? Because disclosure is another whole topic that we didn't get into. That's a very individualized decision. And so chances are there's probably many people you work with who do identify as disabled and have not disclosed that. I feel like as programs, we need to do better about communicating that very forthrightly. And that is, some additional labor on the part of the person interested in becoming a healthcare provider. But asking those questions and applying and self-advocating, as well as finding a champion in that program, either someone with shared experiences or someone whose work has talked about access and advocacy. Hopefully that will begin to shape our professions a little bit more inclusively in the future.
Evans, any advice to our prospective medical trainees?
I have not gone through medical school. And so I would probably give the same advice that I give to graduate students as they start their programs, which is stay connected. Reach out to other disabled people and stay connected. And by that, I don't mean you have to get together every week. And I don't mean that they have to be in the same even city that you're in, more or less campus. We all know graduate school is hard enough. Everybody has a little bit of the imposter syndrome. But if you are disabled, then doesn't matter how well you know something, that internalized ableism will rear its ugly head. And particularly when you're in an environment like higher education or medical training, in which you're just surrounded by messages that you're not really meant to be there. So many disabled students, and myself included, navigated higher education constantly waiting for someone to figure out that they had accidentally let me slip through the cracks and into the room. And so I would just say it is so important to stay connected to community, to people that you can commiserate with, who are not necessarily going to solve anything for you, but can hear you, will see you. I mean those in the figurative sense of knowing what you're going through, supporting you, and people that can help you laugh and stay angry rather than quit.
Mm.
Oh my God.
So, so just to be really blunt, that's how I feel about it.
I'm open about the fact that a lot of my work is driven by anger.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a powerful motivator.
I do too.
Well, that's great advice from both of you. Thanks so much. And thanks so much for meeting with me today and for this conversation. Just so enlightening and such a pleasure talking with you guys.
Thank you so much. This was really fun and a great opportunity. Thank you so much for having us.
Dr. Feldner and Dr. Evans, thank you so much for taking the time and space to share your insights and expertise, and for your ongoing work to empower disabled people and populations. To our audience, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the Docs with Disabilities podcast. If you enjoyed this discussion, be sure to subscribe to our podcast, check out our previous interviews, and tune in again next time. This podcast is a production of the Docs with Disabilities Initiative and is supported, in part, by the University of Michigan Medical School's Department of Family Medicine and Disability Initiative, the Stanford Medicine Alliance for Disability Inclusion and Equity, and the Ford Foundation. The opinions on this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of the hosts, the respective institutions, or the funders. This podcast is released under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Non-Derivative License. This episode was produced by Lisa Meeks and Nicole Kim, with support from our audio editor, Jacob Thiemann.